Good morning, everyone. Let me pull up on the screen the 5 key sections I'll be presenting before passing it over to the BU team to present their special topic research. Again, just want to double down on Lee's appreciation of the full Boston Indicators team. This full report, it was done collaboratively by all of us over several months. So we like to start the core metrics analysis every year by looking at who's living in the region and how that's changing over time. The first graph I'm going to show is a really simple graph of the total population of the region back to 2010, and we see pretty steady gradual population growth. You can see a little dip right after the pandemic. When we presented this data last year for 2022 and 2023, it actually showed lower levels. The Census Bureau issued some backwards revisions, and the population rebound was a little faster than we initially thought from the pandemic, so a little bit of good news here. These big population shifts are driven by changes in 2 categories. One is natural population change, the net effect of births and deaths. And the other is migration-related changes, right? People's decisions to move in and out of the region. And it's that second category where the biggest shifts happen year to year. So I'm going to show a couple of graphs drilling into that migration-related change a little bit more. This is net domestic migration over the last 20 plus years. And we can see this has been consistently negative. More people moving out of Greater Boston to other parts of the country than in. There's a lot behind a big trend like this, but one of the obvious factors here is the high cost of living in a region like Greater Boston. We did a short report about a year ago where we drilled into these trends by age, and you can see the biggest group choosing to move away is young families in the late 20s and early 30s. Now, fortunately, this has been really consistently offset by people moving in from abroad. Positive for this whole time frame and a higher spike during the Biden administration from roughly 2021 through 2024. So this yellow line is the net effect of both of those together. And over the long sort of sweep of 20 plus years, we can see the yellow bouncing sort of positive, negative, a little bit net positive over the full time frame, but not by a lot. These numbers can feel somewhat abstract. It's just lines on a graph. We released a report recently called Global Greater Boston, which puts much greater detail on who the immigrant groups are who are coming to the region. I just wanted to give a little teaser for that report if anybody's interested in more detail. One of the really cool things we included in this was an interactive map where for any city and town in the region, you can get a list of the top 5 countries of origin for the foreign-born population in that community. And the connection here with those population trends is, think about how sort of more hollowed out many of our regional downtowns would be if it weren't for the Dominican community growing in a place like Lawrence, the Chinese community in Quincy, the Brazilian community in Framingham. This visual just gives you a kind of sense of how varied that story has been around the region. And it's just really important not to lose sight of how important the sort of global wave of immigration to Greater Boston has been for the resurgence of who we are as a region over the last generation. Now, obviously, we know a lot has been changing in 2025. The data I'm showing here lags by a couple of years, depending on which source we're looking at. One thing we do in the report is to try and look at the most recent real-time sources of immigration inflows to Greater Boston during 2025, things like H-1B applications, student visa issuances, deportation orders. Encourage folks to check those out in the report. I wanted to show here, though, some national data. The American Enterprise Institute with researchers at Brookings produced some population estimates of what might be happening with international immigration in 2025. And here's their high-end estimate. Their high-end estimate is that nationwide net international migration to the country is going to drop all the way down to just over 100,000 nationwide. And here's their low-end forecast. Net negative outmigration of over 500,000 people. Here's a really important piece of context for this. Natural population change nationwide in 2024, births outnumbered deaths by 520,000. If we hit that same natural population change nationwide again in 2025, and pair that with this low estimate of net international migration of negative 525,000, the United States would slip into population decline for the first time in our nation's history. So obviously, hugely consequential for who we are as a country, but this is a really big deal in a region like Greater Boston, where almost 1 in 3 residents is foreign-born. Okay, so that's the population backdrop. I want to transition now into the core housing data. So first we'll talk about supply. By now it's well established that the sort of core reason we have this rising affordability challenge is we are simply not building enough homes for all the people who'd like to live in our region. Here's some historic data on that, going all the way back to the 1960s, looking at building permits statewide. And the sort of broad trend here is just we've settled into a pattern of building permits that's far lower than what we were at historically. This is data we've relied on for the housing report card for many years, but building permits are actually not a great measure of how many homes we're actually building. One reason is a permit doesn't guarantee something actually gets built. In a period of high and rising borrowing costs, a lot of projects were getting permitted but not actually constructed. And there's also real data quality issues here where municipalities just haven't been reliably reporting this data up to the Census Bureau. Fortunately, the Census Bureau just released a new data set called the Census Address Count, which really is a much better direct measure of how many units we have nationwide. And in the report card, we present that data for the first time. So here's annual estimates of the number of net new units we've brought online in Massachusetts in the purple line, Greater Boston in the green, using this new census address count data. If you add these up over 5 years, the state added 98,000 new housing units from 2020 to 2025, 71,000 of those in Greater Boston. In the report, as we do in a bunch of different sections, we have municipal data. So this is just a teaser, don't worry about all these specific numbers, but where you can get these estimates at the municipal level. Really important to stress, this is a new data set that we're still learning about, and actually with the government shutdown, we haven't been able to get answers to some questions we have around exactly how these numbers are being calculated. So especially don't stress the sort of 1-year changes. I'd encourage folks to focus more on the 5-year change numbers we have here. But it's clear in broad strokes, we really have built meaningful net new housing in Massachusetts over 5 years. One of the obvious questions this leads to is, if we've built 98,000 new units over the last 5 years, does that mean we're almost halfway to the state's goal of building 220,000 units statewide? I see the Lieutenant Governor shaking her head no. And the answer is no. For a really important basic reason is that goal is looking forwards 10 years. The clock just started ticking on that. That's from the statewide housing target for new homes from 2025 to 2035. And all of these units we're looking at here are kind of baked into that baseline. But there really is good news here to keep in mind. It shows that the local construction industry can build at a pace that if we kept that up annually for the next 10 years, we might really be able to meet that goal. So the question is, what are the kind of leading indicators of our ability to do that in the future? And that's where I want to come back to building permits, because flawed as they really are a leading indicator of the sort of construction industry's plans to build in the future. And so we looked at the best real-time data on building permits. Here's Greater Boston, just year to date, January to July, and we're seeing a real drop. Building permits to date are down 44% from 2021 to 2025. Why are permits down? It's a bunch of big, sort of macroeconomic headwinds. The effect of tariffs, rising the cost of construction inputs, the immigration crackdown, potentially hurting the construction labor force, and then persistently high borrowing costs. So all of that has led to real challenges moving forward. And so broad strokes across this supply section, I'd say it's a real sort of pairing of a good news, bad news story. Good news that we've built significant new housing in the last few years, making a bit of a dent in our housing shortage, but real warning signs around whether that will continue into the future. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of the homeownership market? And then I'll talk about the rental market. The story here isn't going to surprise anybody. Home prices, continue to increase. Encourage folks to check out more granular data in the report. If you look at the trend on home values statewide over the last few years, if you kind of squint at it, you can see a little bit of a leveling off in 2025. So again, a little bit of good news maybe in the last year, but they're leveling off at very high prices. So I'm going to show 2 maps. This first map is median single-family sale prices region-wide, and as of June 2025, 36 communities in Greater Boston had a median price of above $1 million. I think even more troubling than the data at the top end of the market is the data at the bottom end. 10 years ago, just in 2015, there were 57 communities in Greater Boston that had a median single-family sale price below $500,000. Today, that's down to only 3. Same map, but looking just at median prices for condos in Greater Boston. Prices for condos obviously a bit lower than for single-family homes, but still really high. 9 municipalities in the region are above $1 million here. In Boston, the number's at just about $840,000 for a median-priced condo. So the next thing we wanted to do in the homeownership section was to do a kind of simulation of what this means for the ability of renter households to get into entry-level homes in Greater Boston. So what I'm going to show in the next slide is a table doing this simulation. It's based off of an analysis that the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard did. I want to give them a real appreciation for helping us with this. There's a lot going on in this table. Let me just orient you to it. The columns are price changes over the last 5 years. And then the first 3 rows I'm showing here are the key inputs for the cost of a monthly payment on an entry-level home. If you look just at the first row here, the entry-level home price, this is not median sale prices in Greater Boston. This is the typical price for a home at the bottom third of the market. And even homes at the bottom third of the market are up by over $100,000 in just 4 years. Then we've got closing costs in the down payment. And then the other big driver in recent years of costs going up is interest rates more than doubling. They've actually gone down a little bit since 2023, but comparing 2025 to 2021, still up by more than double. So here's what this means in terms of the sort of estimated cost of that monthly payment. Up by over $1,600 a month to almost $4,200 a month in 2025 to afford just an entry-level home in Greater Boston. And then we take these numbers and say, well, what would you need in terms of annual income so that those monthly payments don't make up more than 30% of that income? That's up to over $160,000 a year just to afford that entry-level home. And then let me show another table oriented somewhat similarly, but this is just estimates of how many renter households in Greater Boston can afford those prices. The top row is that annual income needed again. We break it out for different racial categories. If you first just look at that bottom row, you see that we've cut by almost half the number of renter households who can afford an entry-level home in just 4 years. Also look as one example for black households in 2025, we estimate just a little bit over 8,000 black families that are renter households in Greater Boston can currently afford an entry-level home. So a whole lot of dire consequences of these trends in recent years. One of them is that young families are delaying further and further into the future their ability to buy their first home. The National Association of Realtors just released data nationwide showing that in 2025, the median age of first-time homebuyers in the United States reached 40. That was down to just 31 about 10 years ago. So you see in the discourse how much affordability politics are taking over the political discourse right now. This is one graph that provides good evidence for why that is. Okay, rents. I'll do this a little bit more quickly. It's a similar story to the home price one. This looks at typical rents. It's a blended measure for all different types of units in Greater Boston compared to the major metro areas in the country. Really steady increases. There was a dip during the pandemic in most metro areas, but that was very short-lived. In Greater Boston, we have the 5th highest prevailing rents of any metro area in the country, just a tick under $3,000 today. The main reason for this is there just aren't that many rental units available. This looks at rental vacancy rates in Greater Boston compared to a subset of cities, and we have the very lowest rental vacancy rate as of 2024. And when there are just very few units available at any point in time, that gives landlords far more leverage to push up prices. It also opens up the door for discrimination, right? If landlords have much more leverage, they are able to be much choosier about who they pick. So this sets up really terrible conditions for renter households. This data ends in 2024. There's a little evidence that in 2025, in some small neighborhoods around college campuses, vacancy rates may have ticked up a little bit. We've got data in the report. Again, this is just a teaser. Don't worry about digesting all of this. But this is changes in prevailing rents across a bunch of neighborhoods in the metro core over the last 4 years. And again, depending on which neighborhood you look at, you might see a little bit of slowing in the increase in 2025, but pretty consistent increases across the board over 4 years. And then finally, let me end with homelessness and housing instability. There's more in the report that I'm going to show here. We've got data on evictions and foreclosures in particular. Want to give a huge shout out actually to the Center for Housing Data at Mass Housing Partnership that does a great housing instability monitor that get updated regularly with much more granular data on some of this at the municipal level. Here I'm just going to show first top line trends in homelessness in Greater Boston. You can see the huge spike in homelessness in 2024, a little decline in 2025, but still at really elevated rates. This data is based on a point in time count at one evening in late January. So the 2025 point here, I think, was just like a week into the new Trump administration. So doesn't give us good data on what's happening through 11 months of this year. One place we do have a little bit better, more real-time data is on the state's shelter caseloads. This is a graph of that. You can see the big spike in sort of late 2023 through 2024 as a result of the migrant crisis, families fleeing hardship abroad, coming here without the ability to get a work permit. That's declined really rapidly through 2025. I actually saw a press release recently. I think we've got the number here for July. I think as of maybe October, it's down even more to something like 2,500 families. So maybe good news here. I think the big question here is, where have those families gone? If they've shifted into permanent housing, that's a good news story. If they've shifted into unsheltered homelessness or been forced to go back to their home countries, that's more troubling. Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath and just end with a QR code for folks. If you're interested in receiving research like this from Boston Indicators and you're not already on our list, please check that out. I'd say top line across all of this, the big story is a period of real uncertainty. We know that 2025 has been a year of great shifts in our communities and society, and housing is an area where that's playing out as well.